we'll be navigating middle fossa and cavernous sinus. So we're moving off of the anterior fossa back to the middle fossa. And we saw this morning. We'll be peeling up the dura on the middle fossa here, taking off the clinoid, exposing the third nerve in the oculomotor triangle. As we peel this dura, we see the greater petrosal nerve. We can follow it back to the geniculate ganglion and even down to the internal acoustic meatus. We want to stay out of the cochlea in this area at the cochlear angle between the labyrinthine segment and the greater petrosal nerve if we're going to preserve hearing. And then we'll have the opportunity, if you drill the bone along the floor, you see what fossa? Temporal, infratemporal. You open anteromedial and anterolateral triangle, and you're into sphenoid sinus. And in the area behind the greater petrosal nerve, we call that what triangle? Kawasis or posteromedial. And in that triangle, we'll be drilling out petrous apex to do an exposure down to the side of the clivus, and we can drill out the internal acoustic meatus, but we always want to save the cochlea in the cochlear angle. And this is just a blow-up of the anterior petrosectomy and the approach to the internal acoustic meatus. And here we've elevated the ganglion out of the middle fossa, and we see greater petrosal nerve become vidian nerve. What is this ligament? Petrolingual. And this ligament passing above the sixth nerve, Gruber's ligament. This is sixth nerve coming under that ligament in Dorello's canal. And just a view again of Dorello's canal. And here the greater petrosal being joined by the deep petrosal from the carotid plexus running forward as vidian nerve. Sixth nerve always runs on the medial side of the first trigeminal division. Oftentimes when the sinus is peeled up and this area exposed, people say, where is the sixth nerve? Well, if you depress V1, you see the sixth nerve here at the back of Parkinson's triangle, below the fourth nerve, coming through Dorello's canal and passing forward on the medial side of V1. So that here we've just peeled up the dura. Meckel's cave here comes forward to about the level of the trigeminal ganglion. Here we see the oculomotor nerve, and it's in the oculomotor cistern that extends forward to about the tip of the clinoid process. And we opened Meckel's cave, this arachnoid cavern. It extends forward to about the level of the mid part of the ganglion. Only V1 up here faces the cavernous sinus. This part of the ganglion and Meckel's cave is really middle fossa. It's in the middle fossa triangles. And here we've removed the arachnoid. We see the nerves entering superior orbital fissure. 3, 4 comes forward and then turns medially across the top of third division under the clinoid, V1. And this is a little bit of 6 that's come forward along the medial side of V1, V2, V3. And here we see the 6th nerve coming through Dorello's canal under the petrosphenoid or Gruber's ligament. And if you look medial to the sensory part of the trigeminal nerve, you see the motor root that passes forward and enters the anteromedial side of foramen ovale. So that, and here we see we've opened anteromedial and anterolateral triangle to expose the sphenoid sinus. And here is just the overview of all of these triangles: clinoidal, oculomotor, supratrochlear, infratrochlear, anteromedial, anterolateral, Glasscock's, Kawases. And you can look at this area from above, and here we see the clinoidal triangle and the triangular oculomotor triangle from anterior clinoid to posterior clinoid over to petrous apex. And we see the sixth nerve, as it enters cavernous sinus from the back, passes through the upper part of the inferior petrosal sinus, and that explains the six nerve palsies or paresis that we see after sampling blood from with a catheter from the inferior petrosal sinus. This is the area of those triangles that we were talking about on the back of the cavernous sinus. Let's see. And just a view, we've opened the clinoidal triangle, the oculomotor triangle, sixth nerve in Dorello's canal. Oftentimes these carotids bulge into and indent the lateral side of the pituitary, and usually when you look from above you don't see the posterior lobe. It's set here below the dorsum in the concave side of the dorsum. We see the inferior hypophyseal arteries. Now we're going to move into that back part of middle fossa. And how many parts to temporal bone? Anyone? What part of temporal bone is this? Forms floor of middle fossa, lateral wall of middle fossa. Anyone? Squamosal part. Posteriorly is mastoid part, petrous part medially. Tympanic part here forms the back wall of the condylar fossa and the lower and anterior margin of the external canal. And the fifth part is the styloid part. We'll talk more about this tomorrow, but all of you have had a little introduction to this. We're looking at floor of middle fossa. We peel the dura back to the petrous ridge. Where is the cochlea?
B.
Everyone. At B here, in back of the greater petrosal nerve, just distal to where it exits the geniculate ganglion. Now, cisternal, meatal, and then from fundus to geniculate ganglion, what segment of facial nerve? Labyrinthine. And distal to that is tympanic segment. Now, where are you going to drill if you're coming through the mastoid from lateral to open the superior vestibular area, the fundus of the meatus? Where do you drill? At A. We said all the canals, the three, have an ampulated and a non-ampulated end, and the ampulated end of the superior and lateral canal is anterior, and so when you drill through this area, you'll expose superior vestibular area when you're coming through the labyrinth. And inferior vestibular area, you're going to drill at the lower end of the posterior canal at D to expose inferior vestibular area. And the common crus is going to be located at B, here where the back end of the superior and the up end of the posterior canal join. So as we look at middle fossa, medially you have trigeminal impression, and then it rises up to a prominence that we call the trigeminal prominence, and then it sinks down again into a depression above the internal acoustic meatus. We call this the meatal depression, and then it rises up at the arcuate eminence, and lateral to the arcuate eminence is this paper-thin bone that we call the tegmen, and it roofs the external canal, the tympanic cavity, and the mastoid antrum, all set below this paper-thin bone that is the most common site of spontaneous or post-mastoid leaks into the middle ear. And here we see the greater petrosal nerve, and under it is the carotid artery. Usually the carotid lateral to the trigeminal nerve is covered by bone, but in about 15% of cases there will be a dehiscence of bone over the carotid artery lateral to the trigeminal nerve. So now we've drilled out the middle fossa. We see the mastoid, the external canal, tympanic cavity, internal acoustic meatus, and the area along the carotid. And is the cochlea going to set at A or B? It's going to be at B. So a way of thinking about this area is to think about it as what I call the rule of Y. External canal is one limb, internal canal the second limb, and the eustachian tube is the third limb. And along this anterior limb of the letter Y is this structure, which is the, anyone? In the roof of the eustachian tube, nestled up right against the carotid, separated from the carotid by a little thin shell of bone, is the tensor tympani, innervated by the facial nerve. Yes? No? Five innervates the tensor tympani. So you have tensor tympani, eustachian tube, greater petrosal, and carotid, all oriented along that anterior limb of the letter Y. Setting at the junction of the three limbs is the tympanic cavity, incus, malleus, stapes, here in the tympanic cavity, and then also wrapped around the junction of the three limbs is the cochlea and the vestibule, into which the semicircular canals open at this junction. So here we're looking at the junctional area, superior, lateral, posterior canal, tympanic cavity, tensor tympani. Is cochlea going to be at A or B? It's going to be at B, and this is facial,